Here's the answer for day 2, problem 1. Find the domain and range of this function. F of x equals the square root of x minus 3. Start by finding the domain. Domain is a list of all numbers that could be used for the x coordinate. When we look at the function, we want to see if it's okay to use all real numbers for x, or if there are some numbers that can't be used. Numbers that cannot be used are called restricted values. This is a square root function, so the math rule that's important to know here is that you cannot have the square root of a negative number. For example, there's no such thing as the square root of -1 or the square root of -20. It's okay to have the square root of 0. The square root of 0 is just 0. And certainly you can have the square root of positive numbers. So we want to make sure that x is a number that doesn't cause this expression inside the square root to turn out to be negative. So what we don't want to happen is we don't want x minus 3 to end up being less than 0. We don't want it to be less than 0. X minus 3 cannot be less than 0. Adding 3 to both sides, we have that x cannot be less than 3. Another way to interpret saying that x cannot be less than 3 is to say that x can be any real number greater than or equal to 3. You could write this in symbols like this. X must be greater than or equal to 3. Now let's do the range. The range is the list of all values that can be generated using this formula for function f of x. It's the f of x values. Let's think about the square root of x minus 3. What kind of numbers can this output? A principal square root like this one that doesn't have the negative in front, meaning you're taking a negative square root, can only output 0 or positive numbers. If x was 3, then this would say the square root of 0, which would output 0. And if x was a number greater than 3, this square root would output positive numbers. But what it cannot output is negative numbers. So f of x can be any real number greater than or equal to 0. You could write this in symbols like this. F of x is greater than or equal to 0. Day 2, problem 2. Solve the quadratic equation by factoring. Here we have a trinomial. There's not a greatest common factor, but this trinomial does factor using a pair of binomials. X times x is x squared. We need a pair of numbers that multiply together to create -9. There are some possibilities. -3 times +3 makes -9. -1 times 9, or +1 times -9. To know which pair of numbers is correct, we look at the middle term, which is -8. Which pair of these numbers combine together to make -8? And that would be a +1 and a -9. So here we want to have a +1 and a -9. And then that's equal to 0. We can now use the zero product property to solve for x. If x plus 1 times x minus 9 is equal to 0, then the x plus 1 factor is equal to 0, or the x minus 9 factor is equal to 0. Solving this first equation, we find x is -1, or over here, x is 9. Here are the two solutions for x.